9 kings followed Edward's coffin through the streets of London. King George V, his successor, the Kaiser, his nephew, the King of Belgium, the King of Spain, the kings of Portugal, Denmark, Bulgaria, Norway, and Greece. The watching, awe-struck crowds were reminded that Britain was the center of an empire on which the sun never set. The most glittering jewel of all was India. The great Durbar at Delhi in 1911 seemed to set the seal on British rule.
Wearing their purple coronation robes and preceded by attendants carrying peacock fans, yak tails, and golden maces, their majesties took their thrones and faced the tens of thousands of their subjects.
King George V wrote in his diary,
"The most beautiful and wonderful sight I ever saw. I wore a new crown for India which cost £60,000. The amphitheater contained about 12,000 people and about 18,000 troops.
"119 princes and maharajas bowed and retracted in a ceremony which lasted a full hour. The Delhi Durbar affirmed the bond between the King-Emperor and more than 300 million Indian subjects. Africans, too, were subjects of the British Crown. To Cecil Rhodes had come the dream of linking British possessions with a railway from the Cape to Cairo. The almost unbroken pink up the map of Africa showed the dream well on the way to realization. And there were the white dominions, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. These were the lands where men of British stock had driven down new routes, creating British populations in far distant places, half as numerous as the Britons who stayed at home. In the British Isles, life for many was a struggle for daily bread. The national wealth of the country in 1914 has been computed at £14,300 million. But in the black deserts of Britain's industrial towns, working-class families could not afford decent clothes or enough to eat. In London at the turn of the century, 30.7% of the population were living below the poverty line. In York, 28% existed on a diet less generous than that of the workhouse. Small wonder that the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Lloyd George, wrote,
"Our working populations, crushed into dingy and mean streets, with no assurance that they would not be deprived of their daily bread by ill health or trade fluctuations, were becoming sullen with discontent."
As in Germany and in France, the workers turned to socialism. The Labour Party was born. But 40 Labour MPs could not provide a remedy. Only through the rapidly growing trade union movement could the workers assert their demands. In 1911 and 1912, Britain was swept by a wave of strikes more complete and embittered than any yet seen. The trade union leader, Ben Tillett, said,
"It was a great upsurge of elemental forces. It seemed as if the dispossessed and disinherited classes were all simultaneously moved to assert their claims upon society."
The ruling classes reacted with furious incomprehension. In Liverpool, troops were brought in to fire over the heads of the crowds. A man told Sir Austin Chamberlain,
"I think the situation's so serious that I went this morning to a wholesale armourer's to buy 5 revolvers. The shopman said, 'We had 100 yesterday, we had 50 when we opened this morning, we have not one left now.'
This was England, facing a class struggle such as she had not seen for over half a century. Facing also the dispossessed who had nothing to do with class. The women. The old fight for women's rights received a new impetus from the militant suffragette movement.
Nothing was safe from their attacks. Churches were burned, public buildings and private residences destroyed. Bombs were exploded. The police and individuals assaulted, meetings broken up.
At Epsom, on Derby Day, a suffragette waited to throw herself under the king's horse. She died of her injuries. Workers and women. There were others too whose discontents were coming to a head. Southern Ireland was clamoring for home rule. Her spokesman was Eamon de Valera.
The militarist power which has kept Ireland within its grasp for centuries can never be persuaded to let go. If liberty is not entire, it is not liberty.
The Irish struggle brought Britain to the very edge of civil war. Poverty and envy, riches and arrogance, ambition and frustration, doubt and demand, these were the tensions of every industrial state. And to them were added the tensions between states themselves. In Britain, alarm grew with the growth of the German fleet just across the water. Public opinion, disunited on almost everything else, was united on the need for battleships. Each launching, whether in Barrow or in Bremen, drove Britain and Germany further and further apart. Even men as sympathetic towards Germany as Lord Haldane could say,
"Peace was to be preserved, but preserved on what terms? On the terms that the German was so strong by land and sea that he could swagger down the high street of the world, making his will prevail at every turn?"
In 1908, Lloyd George met the German ambassador.
I explained to him that the real ground for the growing antagonism in this country towards Germany was not jealousy of her rapidly expanding commerce, but fear of her growing navy.
But the Kaiser did not care.
I do not wish for a good understanding with England at the expense of the extension of the German fleet.
So Germany's naval dreams made Britain a potential enemy, just as her military might had kept alive the hostility of France. The two nations were drawn together by Germany's challenge. The Entente Cordiale was forged. By 1914, when King George V paid a state visit to Paris and rode with President Poincaré through cheering crowds, the Entente was 10 years old. In both countries, men welcomed the end of centuries of rivalry. It seemed a good omen for peace. But the security offered by the Entente Cordiale was delusive. For France had another ally, on the other side of Europe, Russia. Britain, in turn, made an agreement with her. Thus, Germany found herself faced with what her statesmen had always most dreaded, encirclement, potential enemies in the West and in the East. In the summer of 1914, it was not Britain, nor France, nor Russia which held the real threat to the peace of Europe. The real threat lay in the alliance of Germany's making, her alliance with Austria. This was a shackle linking the swelling vigor of Germany to the irresponsible policies of an old, decaying empire. Bismarck foresaw the danger.
I shall not live to see the Great War, but you will see it, and it will start in the East.
For centuries, Austria had been the leading German state, Europe's shield against the East. By 1914, her empire was an anachronism, whose fatal ambitions died hard. At the head of this ancient realm stood the Emperor